It is the custom of this committee to swear all witnesses who are to offer testimony. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to the subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record show that all the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I'd like to briefly, I think all of you are aware of the lighting system here. Green means you're free to give your 5-minute address. Yellow light indicates you've got to wrap up. You've got about a minute left. And then a red light indicates you should cease offering testimony. Let me offer some brief introductions. Although many of the members on this panel have been frequent witnesses. Let me begin. Mr. William Burris is the President of the American Postal Workers Union. Mr. John Hegarty is President of the National Postal Mail Handlers Union, and Mr. Lewis Atkins is Executive Vice President of the National Association of Postal Supervisors. And Mr. Fred Rolando is the new President of the National Association of Letter Carriers. Welcome. Mr. Don Cantrell is the President of the National Rural Letter Carriers Association, and Mr. Mark Strong is Executive Vice President of the National League of Postmasters of the United States. Welcome all. Mr. Burris, I welcome you to make an opening statement. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for convening this hearing and for providing me the opportunity to testify on behalf of the dedicated employees that the American Postal Workers Union is privileged to represent. In response to a dramatic reduction in mail volume, the Postal Service has initiated many programs intended to reduce costs. The Station and Branch Initiative is the most recently announced service reduction. Others include the elimination of Saturday delivery, consolidation of mail processing facilities, delivery route adjustments, and realignment of the bulk mail network. These programs are based on a twofold management analysis, that savings must be achieved and that mail volume will never return to previous heights. Until very recently, postal executives have asserted that the decline in volume was caused by the conversion of hard copy mail to electronic communications. I have long been skeptical of that claim, that individual consumers' increased use of email and the Internet has placed the Postal Service in jeopardy. It is imperative that postal decision makers correctly identify the cause of the reduction in volume and the trends that will drive future communications. Precious time has been lost as attention was focused on an illusory cause. Even now, decisions are being made with scant appreciations of what will cause volume to increase or decrease. I have concluded that the decline in hard copy communications has been less affected by electronic conversion than by the nation's economic downturn. The facts are, it is important to note that our nation's mail volume was highest in 2006, when the use of electronic communication was already widespread. We must also keep in mind that the mail stream is, and will continue to be, dominated by business-related communications, which is especially sensitive to the economic environment. Analysts generally separate mail into household mail and non-household mail and review the interactions between these groups. In 2006, of the 213 billion mail pieces, 190 billion involved non-household communications. Only 2.9%, or 19.4 billion pieces, constituted household-to-household mail. The business community has explored other means of communications and will continue to do so. But these marketing decisions go far beyond the evolution of personal communications. To date, there is no general agreement among analysts about the future of commercial messages. Television, radio, newspaper, email, and online advertising are all receiving mixed analysis of the prospects for growth. And there is no conclusive evidence that the Postal Service will fail to be as competitive in the future as it was in 2006. One respected analyst, Magna, predicts that between now and 2014, mail will grow 2% annually, yet postal management is betting that mail will cease to be relevant. I disagree. Mail has unique advantages over other commercial messaging, including targeting, attention, and retention. I predict that hard copy mail will be competitive far into the future. I admit I have no crystal ball, but neither do the Postmaster General or the Board of Governors. If they are wrong and I am right, the initiative presently underway will leave the Postal Service ill-equipped when mail volume does return. Station and branch closing and 5-day delivery schemes will unquestionably have a negative effect on the postal monopoly and will impede the Postal Service's ability to compete. These are acts of surrender when the outcome of the battle is still in doubt. Nonetheless, the Postal Service must respond to the recent declines in mail volume, and I commit the cooperation of my union in sensible and effective efforts. Regrettably, the rush to legislative reform in 2006 has been a major contributor to the Postal Service's current financial predicament. Major mailer associations, management associations, the Postmaster General, the Board of Governors, some labor organizations, and some members of Congress have, through their support of the PAEA, forced the Postal Service to make payments of $14 billion over the last 2 years for future retiree health care liabilities. Those who supported the legislation share in the responsibility for the Postal Service's current financial debacle and the drastic actions undertaken in response. I have been consulted by Postal Management on the subject affecting service and the impact on my members. On the closing of stations and branches, I reminded Postal Management that the APW-USPS collective bargaining agreement, which remains in force through November 20th of next year, includes the following. The parties agree that all existing retail operations will remain within the installation of which they are a part, and all future retail operations established within the jurisdiction of an installation shall become a part of that installation. I personally negotiated that language and know what its intent was at the time of negotiations. I expect that Postal Management will fully comply with this contractual agreement. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burris. Mr. Hegarty, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chaffetz, and the other members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify here today. Let me take this opportunity to thank you and all members of the subcommittee for your diligent efforts on H.R. 22. We look forward to working with you as that legislation and the recently introduced Senate Bill S-1507 work their way through the legislative process. As requested, my testimony today will focus on the current realignment efforts of the Postal Service dealing with the closing and consolidation of facilities and the realigning of stations and branches. I will also discuss the impact of such decisions on the flow of current and future mail and the resulting impact on mail handlers, postal customers, and communities. As you know, mail handlers work primarily at the large processing facilities. At the same time, however, we represent approximately 1,000 mail handlers who are situated at the larger stations and branches. While they may be employed at smaller facilities, some of these mail handlers actually are assigned to a larger facility as part of their postal installation. As we have previously discussed, the Postal Service is proceeding to realign its network of mail processing plants by conducting area mail processing studies. I will not repeat prior testimony here, but I think I should note that, as I have said in prior testimony, our concern is A, that the process is accomplished uniformly and within the established guidelines, and B, that the future postal network is not cut too severely such that the Postal Service will not be prepared to provide universal service and low-cost service when mail volumes recover. Our solution to a rational closing and consolidation approach is to review such changes on a case-by-case basis, following a careful analysis of the facts presented in each situation. Where the proposal makes economic and logistical sense, where service standards will not be negatively affected, where major mailers in the area will not be inconvenienced, and where all negotiated requirements with the unions have been complied with, then the Mail Handlers Union will not simply oppose a closing or consolidation simply for the sake of opposition. Conversely, the Postal Service should not be closing and consolidating facilities just so the agency can say that it is closing and consolidating. The impact on mail handlers is varied, depending on the circumstances, but some of the affected employees have had their hours of work or work location drastically altered, thereby severely disrupting their family life. Employees have had to scramble to make alternate child care arrangements to get their kids to school, or their spouses have had to adjust their work schedules to juggle the various responsibilities. Many employees have been faced with the almost impossible task of either moving their families hundreds of miles away to remain employed by the Postal Service or to give up their postal careers altogether. And I think you highlighted that in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, outlining the situation that we talked about at the last hearing, where employees were offered jobs, some of them 400 miles away from their current duty station. The impact on the customers will also vary, depending on the circumstances. Our concern is that we may end up losing business because a major customer decides it's just as easy to use a competitor and they abandon the Postal Service altogether. We also need to factor in the individual customers who need and deserve access to postal services. The impact on communities should also be factored into any final decisions on consolidation. What will be the impact if a large plant is closed and the employees then are moved to another plant to work in some other community? How about local businesses like restaurants and other retail establishments who used to cater to this large factory that employed so many people? Many of the other topics on which the subcommittee is seeking input really need to be answered by the Postal Service before we can weigh in on them. But as always, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And again, thank you for inviting me to testify.
Thank you, President Hegarty. Mr. Atkins, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Lynch and Ranking Member Chavis and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Louis M. Atkins. I serve as Executive Vice President of the National Association of Postal Supervisors. We are recognized by the United States Postal Service as representing over 35,000 current and retiring management employees of the Postal Service. I am honored by your invitation to appear before you and to provide our organization feedback on the Postal Service plan to examine the potential closure or consolidation of many postal stations and branches that comprise the national retail network. Over the years, the Postal Service has continually made minor adjustments in the location of its retail operation to improve the efficiency of the mail service and its service to the American public. The scale of these changes has been relatively small in comparison to what lies before us. But now the efforts of consolidating up to 3,100 facilities across the country, some in your own congressional districts, will significantly impact our customers and your constituents. We have concern and reservations about the underlying review process and its likely results and consequences. I wish to share with you concerns with you right now. The Postal Service review of approximately 3,100 customer service operations is focused on area located primarily in urban centers, large cities, or in highly developed suburban communities. No matter where you go across the country, Postal Service retail operations are a business anchored to the communities they serve. Businesses that share a general location with the Postal Service benefits from the Postal Service retail presence in the community. My organization's fundamental aim is to support the efficiency operation of the Postal Service. But the scope of the Postal Service reviews and potential consolidation could impact nearly 10% of the facilities and serve urban and highly developed communities. The repercussions of a move that large could be modest in terms of dollar savings and considerably negative from a customer service standpoint. Let me explain why. Since the target facilities and operations are in urban areas and developed suburban communities, many residents rely on their local post office as being within walking distance, especially those who are elderly or without a car. Today, many of our customers in urban areas enjoy the convenience of walking to their local post office to conduct their postal-related business. If the Postal Service plans are implemented, these customers will face a distance to the nearest post office that will be greater than the current one, a distance not likely to be able to walk. The elderly, who are less likely to connect to the Internet, rely more heavily on their local post office retail unit and will feel a greater loss of convenience and connection to their post office. When packages cannot be delivered by the letter carriers and the customers need to go to their local post office, customers will have a further distance to travel to retrieve their mail. These are some of the impacts that will be felt by customers who lose their local post office. In addition, the financial savings from consolidation may not be as large as first appear. In a facility that serves both delivery and retail, the relocation of a carrier unit to another facility will mean that the portion of the building devoted to carrier floor space will become vacant, and only the curbside portion of the building devoted to retail operation will continue to be used. Should the post office determine that it is best to separate the retail and carrier operations in their present location, keeping only the retail operation in place will not necessarily present savings if the post office is leasing the facility and obliged to continue to pay a long-term lease for the entire space. Due to the requirements of the Postal Service operation, the empty space may not lend itself to subleasing to another business entity. In facilities owned by the Postal Service, the same problem will occur in attempting to lease out the empty space resulting from moving of a carrier operation to another location. This dilemma will ultimately result in a move of the Postal Service to eliminate the retail operation in the location, and this would negatively impact customers, I explained earlier. The Postal Service leases nearly 85% of the facilities and housing, processing, delivery, and retail operations. So the cost of leasing facility presents a tremendous burden on the Postal Service. Considering the high percentage of the leased facilities operated by the Postal Service and underlying and substantial long-term financial obligations they represent, it will be difficult for the Postal Service to achieve significant savings through the consolidation or closing of its leased properties. Where the Postal Service owns the real estate that houses carriers and retail operations, the consolidation and closure of delivery or retail operations at those properties may also be problematic when the sale of that property is attempted. Given today's depressed commercial real estate values, the closing of the local post office will also result in additional vacancy storefront in an already depressed local economy. Our organization support the efforts of the Postal Service to maintain its viability in these trying times. The Postmaster General deserves credit for his efforts to reduce costs and improve efficiency. Our greatest concern is that in a rush to consolidate and close as many as 3,100 retail or delivery units, significant savings may turn out to be a mirage and that customers may suffer. We cannot continue to disenfranchise customers of the Postal Service who live in urban areas and not burden those who are least able to bear the cost. This concludes my testimony, and I am prepared to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Mr. Rolando, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Shavitz, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Ms. Norton. My name is Fred Rolando. I'm the President of the National Association of Letter Carriers, which represents more than 300,000 active and retired letter carriers nationwide. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I have seen the Postal Service thrive, and I have seen it struggle through some very difficult times, but I've never seen a crisis like the one we are facing now. Volume is expected to drop by 30 billion pieces this year, the worst decline since the 1930s. When you couple the economic crisis with the grossly unfair policy advanced by the previous administration to require the Postal Service to pre-fund a massive 75-year liability for future retiree health benefits over just a 10-year period, it should come as no surprise that the Postal Service faces a crisis of its own. The Postal Service is responding with service cuts and downsizing. Its branch and station optimization program and the 5-day delivery study are part of that response. As Congress reviews these developments, it should ensure that the Postal Service does not make structural decisions that will do more harm than good over the long run. Downsizing to meet depression-level demand without considering the long-term impacts on the ability of the Postal Service to meet new demands when the economy recovers would be short-sighted. Short-term savings that undermine the Postal Service's capacity to offer new services and to take advantage of future growth opportunities would be self-defeating. NALC has a long history of working with the Postal Service to improve efficiency and to adjust to change, and we have continued that tradition in this crisis. We developed a special expedited route adjustment process to help the Postal Service adjust to the fluctuating mail volume. These adjustments, along with the initiatives for flat sequencing systems, have reduced the number of city carriers by more than 11,000 during the past year and will save the Postal Service billions of dollars over time. Looking ahead, it will be just as important to boost postal revenues as it will be to reduce costs. We believe the uses of our unmatched delivery network could be expanded to provide a whole range of valuable services, like the one proposed by the leaders on this subcommittee to use letter carriers to conduct the next census. That's why we must be careful with branch and station consolidations and reject drastic proposals like the elimination of Saturday delivery. The cost of lost opportunities from service cuts and other operational changes must be recognized. The Postal Service and its employees are doing all that they can to respond to this crisis, but Congress can also help to both minimize the short-term pain of the recession for the Postal Service, its employees and customers, and to maximize the long-term potential of the Postal Service. It can do so by reforming the retiree health pre-funding provisions in the law. The current schedule of pre-funding payments is unaffordable and unreasonable. Moreover, the actuarial methods adopted by OPM to implement the pre-funding policy discriminate against the Postal Service and significantly increase its costs. While both H.R. 22 and the legislation developed by the Office of the Management and Budget offer similar short-term relief for the Postal Service, and while we have given our support to both proposals, they simply do not provide a long-term solution. Comprehensive reform is needed to address the Postal Service's financial situation and future viability. Overhauling the pre-funding policy and reforming the OPM's policies with respect to the Postal Service must be a part of this reform if the Postal Service is to continue to provide affordable, universal postal service. The Postal Service is the nation's oldest and most trusted government agency. It would be a tragedy to sacrifice its future viability because of unfair and questionable policy decisions made by OPM that are fossilized into current law because CBO scoring rules prevent their reconsideration. My members hope that this subcommittee and the full House of Representatives will not let this happen. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify. It's my first time. I hope it's not my last time, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
I don't think you have to worry about this being your last time testifying. You'll be a frequent flyer here. Thank you, Mr. Rolando. Mr. Cantrell, would you please take 5 minutes for an opening statement?
Thank you. I'd like to ask that my full testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chavez, members of the subcommittee, my name is Don Cantrell, and I'm president of the National Rural Letter Carriers Association, which represents 123,000 bargaining unit letter carriers. Our members work in rural, suburban, and urban areas throughout the United States and function as a post office on wheels because rural letter carriers offer postal customers all of the services performed over the counter at a post office. Mr. Chairman, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you and Representatives John McHugh and Danny Davis for your leadership on H.R. 22. I'd also like to thank the chairman of the full committee, Representative Ed Towns, for his dedication in getting this important legislation passed at the full committee level. While H.R. 22 will not solve all the Postal Service's problems during this financial crisis, it is a step in the right direction. We are living in a challenging time. Our country is in a deep recession, and the Postal Service is a bellwether of the nation's economic well-being. Mail volume is down 11.9% in the first half of this year, and the Postal Service is expecting to lose approximately $7 billion. The decline in mail volume has hit the rural carrier craft extremely hard. Rural carrier pay is based on the evaluated compensation system, which is unique not just to the Postal Service, but to American industry in general. In our evaluated compensation system, each rural carrier is paid an annual salary based upon an estimated amount of time it will take to deliver the mail on his or her individual route. This evaluation of the individual route is based upon an annual mail count, whereby over 30 separate elements are counted, timed, or measured. The most recent mail count earlier this year was devastating to our members. For the second straight year, our members have been hit hard in the pocketbook. The average rural route lost just over 2 hours evaluation per route, which equates to more than $3,400 a year in annual salary. As a result of this year's mail count, rural routes were reevaluated and adjusted. Prior to the 2009 mail count, over 42,000 rural carriers delivered routes of mail 10 out of the 12 days each pay period. After the mail count, the number of rural carriers who delivered this kind of route dropped to just over 27,000. Meanwhile, the number of carriers who delivered 11 out of the 12 days each pay period, and still others who delivered 12 out of the 12 days each pay period, increased significantly. In order to avoid significant salary reductions, thousands of rural carriers opted to work an extra day just to keep the same salary they were making prior to the mail count. The annual mail count directly affects rural carrier salaries and schedules, but there are other concerns we have about our very livelihood. If the post office or postal service were to consolidate the operation of retail stations and branches into nearby postal facilities, that would only compound what has, for rural carriers over the last several years, become a serious problem. If post offices begin to disappear, our carriers will have to travel greater distance to work, and our customers will increasingly feel isolated from the Postal Service. During these economic times, paying close attention to customer service is a key, and we would expect a public outcry if post office stations and branches across the country are closed. Customers, especially in rural areas, will be particularly inconvenienced, and some will unfortunately decide it is simply not worth doing business with the Postal Service. We will be sending the wrong message if offices across the country begin to close their doors. Our customers and communities need to know that the Postal Service is here to stay. I'd like to say a few words about the Postal Service interest in reducing Postal Service delivery days. Instituting 5-day delivery would likely mean further salary decreases for thousands of carriers, not to mention massive job losses. It could mean salary cuts and layoffs for workers employed by businesses in the mailing community. If 5-day delivery were implemented, our evaluated compensation system, which is often praised by the Postal Service for its efficiencies, would need to be re-engineered, and the rural craft could lose 50,000 rural carrier associate jobs. Mr. Chairman, that is 50,000 jobs added to the national unemployment rate of almost 10%. And that's just from one of the 4 postal unions. Mr. Chairman, I know that times and finances are tough right now, but in my opinion, moving from 6 to 5-day delivery would not save the Postal Service. It would only hurt the business model and make other delivery options more attractive to our customers it so desperately needs to attract and retain. This would be a terrible course to chart, and as many observers have noted, could very well do much more harm than good. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have or your fellow members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cantrell. Mr. Strong, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chaffetz, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the National League of Postmasters to testify before you today. Founded in 1887, the League is a management association representing the interests of tens of thousands of postmasters throughout the United States. My name is Mark Strong, and I am the Executive Vice President of the League. More importantly, I am a Level 24 postmaster. In Sun City, Arizona, an unincorporated area in the Phoenix metropolitan area, I have served in that capacity since 1992. The League would like to thank the subcommittee and the full committee for reporting H.R. 22 without amendment. The action has operated as a catalyst and started a legislative ball rolling. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would like to request that my written testimony be entered into record and proceed to briefly summarize my testimony.
Without objection.
A post office and its station and branches has a primary responsibility in a given geographic area for collection, delivery, and some processing. In addition, post offices and their station, branch, and finance units serve a vital function as a network to access points, retail sales points, and final delivery points for post office box holders, a key element of our customer base. The League strongly supports consolidation of collection, delivery, and processing functions where appropriate. We are quite concerned, however, that panicked consolidations could lead to consolidating functions in a way that would cost rather than save the Postal Service money, or negatively affects service. There is often a good reason why carriers are dispersed throughout a community at station and branches, and this reason has to do with urban congestion and traffic rather than mail volume. Looking at my communities, if the carriers from one of my branches were consolidated to another branch or my main post office, the heavy traffic in the Phoenix metropolitan area would add almost an hour additional time per day to each carrier route. I would have to compensate for that time, or service would suffer, and to compensate for that is expensive. This has to be taken into account. There are also questions of sufficient space in a given facility to take new carriers into that facility. In my case, I don't have any to spare. In terms of space, I have been adding in my post office almost 800 deliveries per month for years, which means I have been adding carriers. That number has decreased significantly over the past few years, and it is now at about 80 new delivery points per month. However, last month, there were more building permits issued in my area than there were issued in prior 12 months put together. Thus, I anticipate that my 80 new delivery points per month will start to grow quite rapidly in the not-too-distant future. I have to start thinking about that now, which puts me in an expansion mode, not a contraction mode. While the League supports the notion of consolidating carrier function, it has more fundamental concerns about consolidating retail functions. Service has to be our prime consideration looking to the future. Without good service, we have nothing to offer. Having many retail outlets in the communities allows us to provide better service, and closing any significant number of them will hurt service, and we can't do that. The strongest argument for caution is consolidating retail facilities lies in the area of post office boxes. Today, the reality of carrier delivery is that businesses tend to get their mail very late in the day, far too late to process and deposit checks the day they are received. As businesses have complained about this for years, we have told them that the answer to their problem is to rent post office boxes, where mail is available no later than 11 a.m. By renting a post office box, small businesses can pick up their mail, process their checks, and deposit them the very same day at the local bank with a minimum of hassle. This is a widespread practice, and the quick access to checks that post office boxes provide plays a central role in the financial health to hundreds of thousands of small businesses across the country. Removing quick access could have a devastating effect on our business customers and their float. Time means money for our customers, and it is up to us to serve them, not to have them serve us. There is also fundamental question of how we can consolidate one set of boxes from one post office into another. Generally, there is simply isn't sufficient room in the second post office to accept the boxes from the first, unless more boxes are built in the second office. Building more boxes would tend to create traffic problems in the second post office, since most of these post offices were constructed with a formula for parking that took into account the number of existing boxes. We are the Postal Service, and service does not mean forcing a customer to drive 5 miles in urban traffic to pick up one piece of mail, to encounter a 5-minute wait to park, and then a 20-minute wait inside. In conclusion, I do not want to suggest that no consolidation of carrier and retail functions could occur. Intelligent consolidation is always a good idea. However, efficiency, service, and the needs of the local small business and our customers must come first, and that determination should be a local one. Thank you for considering our views, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. By way of a procedural announcement, they have just informed us that there'll be votes beginning now, basically, on the House floor. There are 15 votes, and it could involve about an hour and a half, at least, of delay. The problem is that what will happen is that our 2 o'clock hearings begin shortly after that series of votes. So what I'm going to suggest is, while the ranking member and I have more than a few questions to ask you, what I would suggest is that I could, rather than have you stay here for several hours waiting for us to come back and get another hearing room, I could submit these questions to you in writing, but I would have to have them back in 10 days in order to get the questions and answers on the record. If that is not an objection from you, then I would like to handle it that way. The other opportunity would be to bifurcate the hearing and call you in on another date and to ask you questions that orally on the record. So, you know, I can do either way. The problem is that we're running into the August recess, and so any oral hearing would have to wait till September. If it's all right with you, I could submit the questions to you in writing. There are some questions we would like to ask right now, and since no one seems to be objecting, I'm going to take that as a yes. Let me just begin. Oh, actually, you want to get something on the record?
Yeah, thank you for your patience and our apologies for the schedule. I wish it wasn't the case, but we appreciate your testimony and being here. And I just wanted to make sure, Mr. Chairman, that the Congressional Research Service, the CRS report, Post Office and Retail Postal Facility Closures Overview and Issues for Congress, dated July 23, 2009, was in the record. If it has not already been included, I'd ask unanimous consent to have it included in the record. Without objection.
Let me ask, and I'll try to leave enough time for the ranking member to ask as well. Mr. Rolando and Mr. Cantrell, you presidents of letter carrier unions, and what we're looking at right here is not only the consolidation of postal facilities, stations and branches, we're also trying to get a sense of what is involved and what the impact of route consolidation is. And I have a less of a grasp of that. I think that you know, everybody understands when a post office is closed, what impact that has. But I'd like to ask you each just to take a minute and describe, I guess in the urban sense and then in the rural sense, what it means and how the route consolidation process has gone, whether or not you've been actively approached by the Postal Service to participate and to have your input. How has that all gone? Mr. Rolando.
Yes, thank you. With respect to the consolidation, we haven't been approached regarding the adjustment of routes, but we have been involved in the joint process of adjusting the routes anyway due to the fluctuating volume. We've been working with the Postal Service for a couple of years to find a more efficient way to jointly adjust our routes, which of course has been necessitated by the drop in volume. Traditionally, we've had volume growth. As we started our studies from our collective bargaining agreement, we had to pretty much stop in our tracks and find a way to adjust to the falling volume. The idea, of course, is the efficiency and having 8 hours work for 8 hours pay. So we've been working together. We're in our second or third rounds to do that, to adjust to the volume. We're doing 2 this year. I can tell you with any consolidations that do occur, it would just be an extension of what we're doing to adjust the routes. Obviously, it would affect travel time to get to and from the route if you're going from a different station. But the idea would be to jointly get on top of it as it happens and keep everything adjusted to the volume and the location and any adjustments that have to be made.
Let me ask you, I know there are, I think, about 350,000 letter carriers. That's probably both unions, is that right? No?
Between us?
Well, more than that, about 400 and something. You got 300, we got 123.
We've got just over 200,000 active letter carriers.
Okay.
So,
yeah. And there's a hiring freeze on right now, right?
Not for us.
Not for the rural?
How come they let you hire?
Because we have a contractual provision that calls for one leave replacement for each route.
Oh, I see.
They can, although we've made some concessions in the last contract that allowed for TRCs, there's still the provision there, and we have some others where had carriers that sub for more than one route and had career status, and that reduced the number. But contractually, we're entitled to a leave replacement for each route, which makes it a little more difficult for them to put a freeze on hiring.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you basically the same question. I know that, Mr. Cantrell, the rural post offices are exempt, I think.
Well, that's not entirely true, because we're experiencing, especially in the, I know in the Wisconsin, Minnesota areas and up through Michigan, that we've seen carriers move from one office to another, because we had several calls complaining that, I don't know if the office was necessarily closed, but the delivery function was consolidated and are driving considerably longer just to get to work and then to go back, drive that same distance to go out and deliver their route. So we're not completely immune to it, although we haven't seen or even been asked about some of the more urban offices that we have and what kind of effect we would have. As far as adjustment, I want to address that just a little bit.
Sure.
We've been in that process since our existence because we're evaluated, and when we're evaluated each year, depending on the volume of mail, whether it's going up or down, our routes are adjusted accordingly. We actually have a cap on how large the routes can grow, which would, when they exceed that, they would be adjusted. We don't have much of a bottom end, and that's why in my testimony, we have a lot of carriers now working all 12 days during a pay period because their routes have dropped below 40 hours. We don't have a guarantee. It's by the actual volume and what the count shows that the route would be. So we'll have some 36, 37-hour routes, and we've gone through those adjustments for years and years. So it's really not anything new for us. What is new is because of the drop in volume is we're seeing more consolidation of routes, even in the more rural areas where the routes have grown so small that it just makes sense when someone retires to consolidate.
Okay. I think my time has expired. Madam Chair, you are more than welcome.
I go too because they're committee of the whole vote. So
okay, that's right.
If I could just ask a few questions before I go.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
I do get to vote on the floor on some things, so you can imagine that I take those opportunities. I want to take this opportunity to commend the employee representatives of the unions before us, because it's clear that you have done what you could and what you can to pitch in. And I think it's a perfect example of why unionization is benefit to the public as well as to management. You got orderly process going on here. Could I ask if any of you have experienced layoffs, straight out layoffs so far? Or if you've been able, so far, it's this downsizing, whatever you want to call it, has occurred without notices of layoff in the traditional sense?
All of our contracts contain provisions governing layoff of employees. In 1978, a national arbitrator, when all the parties were negotiating jointly at the time, imposed conditions that we all share equally regarding layoffs. In our bargaining units, an employee that achieves 6 years of continuous service is protected for lifetime against layoff. The only employees that are exposed to the possibility of layoffs are employees that have less than 6 years of continuous service.
Have any of those been?
No, there are also other legal impediments to layoff because you must merge the RIF procedures with the layoff procedures, because the employees with less than 6 years of service who are veterans have a special process that must be used in order to effectuate layoffs. So it would be a very complicated process.
Well, that's very important to have on the record. I'm going to have to go in a moment.
I'd like to jump in. I'd like to jump in on that one too, if I could. We haven't had any mail handlers laid off, but we've had de facto layoffs. And what I mentioned earlier is a mail handler in Memphis, Tennessee, who's offered a job in, say Oklahoma City,
yes.
404 miles away.
Those. And that is
they have a choice: either quit their job with the Postal Service or move. So in effect, they may be laid off. The second instance is with our part-time flexible employees who have no fixed schedules and no guarantee of work hours. In many areas of the country now, they're only working 4 hours a pay period, which is 2 hours a week.
Well,
so they are in effect laid off.
See, the reason I'm glad to have this on the record is because I am most concerned about some kind of orderly process. I expressed earlier the kind of surprise notion, precipitous layoffs, or for that matter, precipitous transfers. Same difference as far as I'm concerned. I have looked closely at this 5-day week, largely because it's one of the few things I think the public is not going to throw their hands up at. You can bet if some of those post offices or branches in the District of Columbia have to be closed, I'm going to be besieged with people saying, oh, please, whatever you do, don't close that postal service. So I was interested that people have already acclimated themselves to the possibility of a 5-day week, which after all they are on as well, and they've looked at what's happened to the post office. But Mr. Burris, I think Mr. Rolando, Mr. Cantrell, you were pretty clear you did not want to see that happen. I agree with Mr. Burris that watch out for calling the decline and fall altogether the post office. Constitutional post office, nobody up here. The post office is kind of allegiance up here that nothing else I know has. Nevertheless, just as you warn about structural changes, there are structural changes occurring to you, and yet very little of what we've heard, at least until today, involves structural responses right back. Mr. Hegarty went through a list that interested me because he said case-by-case basis, facts in each situation, economic and logistical sense, negatively affects employees, negotiated requirements complied with. Now remember, that's going to take time and should take time. And I just think the union's involvement in whatever happens early is going to be necessary. And I've got to ask you once again, the 5-day week, given the fact that it's going to be hard just to lay people off. Some of these people are leaving because they're aging out, because they can retire and the rest. And given Mr. Hegarty's, I suppose, list or a similar list, would you really think the 5-day week should be off the table when it's not off the table for the general public?
I'd like to say that obviously it has effect on my members, but this isn't about my members or anybody else's members. It's about the institution. It's about the Postal Service.
The public is going to be hurt one way or the other, and the question is, can there be some kind of a census as how to get hurt the least, Mr. Rolando? And I'm going to be looking for advice from people on the ground. Those are the people I respect most, and I've been. When service went down in the district, I then traveled with my postman, as he was. I saw amazing things like people who saw no one every day except the postman. I saw the great allegiance they had. I saw how hard the work was. And when you got some hard choices here, I would rather have employee buy-in than to have what we're seeing the post office do now. They come each time with, oops, we got to do this, as if they couldn't have seen that 3 years ago or 4 or 5 years ago. So that's what I'm putting to you. If that one is not something we can agree upon, it's going to be hard for me to understand what it is that we can get some kind of consensus on to happen in time to save what is the core and root of the service.
What I think we need to, I believe, again, that's a short-sighted response, the 5-day delivery. I think they're going down a totally dark road to respond to the crisis. What we need to do is expand the business. You can look at going from 6 to 5-day, and if you need some money next year, you can go to 4-day, to 3-day, to 2-day. It's just dismantling
and
the company.
And I think that might happen,
Mr.
Rolando. I think that could happen.
Contrary
just let me say this. If somebody saw a whole city go down, the longer you wait, the greater the damage. And the more management is empowered to make the decisions. So I would like to see the kind of collaboration that you have already begun to try to save the Postal Service. I don't think it can be saved except with employee collaboration. You got in place such a strong collective bargaining system. They're going to have to come to you.
Right.
You can delay the thing. And the question is how to preserve what you think is in the best interest of all of you and of the Postal Service, and I got to go vote. And thank you very much for hearing me out. The service is now, the hearing, not the service, for God's sake. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you all for attending.